Now, what I did is, and a number of other people have done that more recently, is that it turns out, or they looked at the wage gap in more detail, and it turns out that this wage gap is not uniform across the population. And it turns out that if one looks at single males and single females, the wage gap is relatively small. It's between essentially 0 and 10%. If one looks at the wage gap for married men and women, it turns out that it's relatively large, in the 40 to 50% range. It turns out that if one looks at married males and females with children, it's even larger. And it turns out that if one looks at married men and women with children that are spaced widely apart, that it's even larger. So this wage gap varies by demographics. And so if it varies by demographics, that is, it's minuscule, or not minuscule, but small for singles, but large for marrieds and larger for marrieds with children, then there's got to be some reason why the companies do not have the same form of discrimination for singles compared to marrieds with children. And the wage gap also varies by age. If you look at young people, the wage gap is small. If you look at older people, it widens. So it widens over the life cycle. And then the other fact is that over time, the wage gap has been declining. So I said in the 1960s, 70s, the wage gap was 40%. Now it's 23%. And if one goes back to 1870 and 1860, there's less data, but the wage gap was even wider. So over the last couple of centuries, the wage gap is narrowing. For young people, it's small. For older people, it's larger. And it varies by marital status and children. So there's got to be some other explanation as to why there is a gender wage gap.